This morning, we're going to be in Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15. As we continue our study of the Gospel of Mark, we are coming now to the last couple chapters. Mark 15. And today we deal with and we see Jesus and his confrontation with Rome and the people's confrontation with Christ. And begin reading in verse 1 of chapter 15. So the words of the Lord. As soon as it was morning, having held meeting with the elders, scribes, and the whole Sanhedrin, the chief priests tied Jesus up and led him away and handed him over to Pilate. So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." And the chief priests accused him of many things, and Pilate questioned him again. "Aren't you going to answer? Look at how many things they're accusing you of." But Jesus still did not answer, and so Pilate was amazed. At the festival, Pilate used to release for the people a prisoner whom they requested, and there was one named Barabbas who was in prison with rebels who had committed murder during the rebellion. The crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do for them as was his custom. So Pilate answered them, "Do you want me to release the king of the Jews for you?" For he knew it was because of envy that the chief priests had handed him over. For the chief priests stirred up the crowd so that he would release Barabbas to them instead. But Pilate asked them again, "Then what do you want me to do with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Again they shouted, "Crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Why? What has he done wrong?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." And wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them, and having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. When we are confronted with truth, how do we respond? Typically, people take several approaches, right? There's denial. There's fear of it. We fight it. Sometimes we accept it. But regardless of how we respond to things that are true and real, it doesn't change the nature of facts. They are still there, no matter how we react to them. There's a riddle that's been ascribed to Abraham Lincoln where he asked the audience, "If you call a dog's tail a leg, how many legs does it now have?" They answered 5. He said, "No, the answer is 4. Calling it a tail does not make it so." And so here we have a group of people of all kinds of backgrounds, right? All kinds of stations of life. We have Jews, we have Romans, we have those who are elites, we have the mass of the crowds, and all of these people are confronted here with the truth of Jesus, who he is, the King of the Jews, a man who is at the same time innocent, but on trial. These truths are presented to them, and we see mass group of people, every single group here, when confronted with truth, instead rejecting it. Deciding to treat this innocent one as guilty, closing their eyes to what is plain before them, proving for one last time in Jesus' earthly life that people there do not have the eyes to see and the ears to hear what has been plain in front of them. So here as we look at the account of Jesus' Roman trial following his Jewish one the night before, we need to ask ourselves, how will we respond to the truth of who Jesus is? Because the truth is the truth, no matter what we do with it. It does not change. So let's look at the story here. We're going to begin with Jesus and Pilate. It's verse 1, and it says, "As soon as it was morning, having had a meeting with the elders, scribes, and the whole Sanhedrin, the chief priests tied Jesus up, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate." Now, there's a lot of background here we need to understand so that we can really help mentally set the scene of what's going on here. So it is sunrise on 6 a.m. The Sanhedrin moves Jesus really quickly because they had to get to Pilate fast if they had any chance of having Jesus executed before nightfall. See, if they wanted Jesus executed on Friday, before the Sabbath began at sundown, and before the Passover got really started, they knew they had to get it done quick. See, Pilate only took cases, judicial cases, from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. So if you weren't there in line, ready to be heard, you didn't get heard. And they needed it then, because they knew they couldn't go on the Sabbath. They'd have to wait until Sunday. And when enough people started to hear that Jesus had been arrested and was being held, then they were afraid of a riot, which we already knew. That was the Sanhedrin's fear. They were afraid the crowds would riot. So they had to get all of this done very quickly. Remember, he was just arrested about 1 a.m. that morning. And now it's 6, so it's only been a few hours, and they're trying to get him to Rome quickly, get him before Pilate, get him executed before really people know what's going on. At least that's their hope. So they go there to ensure their case is heard. So they bound Jesus, they lead him away, verse 1, and deliver him over to Pilate. Pilate. We hear a lot about Pilate, Pontius Pilate. We talk about him. He's in our creeds, right? We know, we hear of this guy. He's in all the Gospels. He's this guy who kind of feels like he doesn't want to do what he does, but in the end he does it. We don't really know what to think about Pilate. But thankfully, we actually do know quite a bit about who Pilate is, what he was like. And it does fit with what we see in the Gospels. See, Pilate was the imperial governor of Judea from 26 to 36 AD. He served for 10 years. He was one of the longest serving governors in Roman history of Judea, right? He served for a very long time. It was really rare to have anybody serve in that area more than a couple years, primarily because no one could keep control of the people. They would constantly riot and constantly threat to rebel, and the governors were being replaced to try to find somebody else. So Pilate served for a really long time. Now, he was an emperor-appointed governor. So he came in, right? It was an imperial province. He was an emperor-appointed governor. And his role was, first and foremost, military. We see him as a judge here. And, he does some of that, but his primary job was military. See, he had somewhere around 1,000 troops under his command. Now, the Roman army was divided into regular troops and auxiliary troops, right? The regular troops were Romans. They were Roman citizens. They were those who were serving. And then the auxiliary troops were those who were soldiers that came out of Roman-controlled areas. So these would have been troops that would come from like Samaria, Syria, other regions that would have been brought into the Roman army. Why? Well, it paid well. And these are people who might one day want to get Roman citizenship, so they joined the army to go that way. So he had about 1,000 troops under his command. Right? But as governor, he also was the head of the Roman judicial system in Judea. That's why he would hear trials, and he'd only do it those first few hours of the day. Right? And he, as the governor, was the only person who had the power to inflict capital punishment. That's why the Sanhedrin take Jesus to him. They are not allowed to execute. They can conduct, and through an arrangement Pilate had made with the Sanhedrin, they can handle what we would today call civil trials, right? If there's little religious or civil issues, right, the Sanhedrin, they were allowed to judge those. But if it had anything to do criminally, that was Pilate's responsibility. So that's why they take Jesus to Pilate. He's the only one allowed to execute people. And so they go there for that reason. Also, we know Pilate would be in charge of collecting taxes, minting coins, public works. In fact, one of the things in Pilate's early days was he needed to build a new aqueduct system going to Jerusalem. He didn't have enough money. The people didn't have enough money, so he went to the temple and stole money from the treasury. The people rioted. He killed a bunch of them. They settled down. And Pilate had his ironclad basically control over the region then for 10 more years. Right? So people didn't really like him. The Sanhedrin did not like Pilate, but they had to honor him. Why? Well, see, one of the things that the governor was allowed to do, because the Sanhedrin was, not ethical, as we've seen over and over again, right? One of the deals he made is so they could keep some power, Pilate was allowed to choose the high priest, which was really shocking, but it was the deal they made. So the Sanhedrin was going to kind of listen to Pilate because he could basically remove them all from power and put whoever he wanted in there. So they had this sort of uneasy agreement between the groups here politically. Pilate, though, is in Jerusalem. He's never in Jerusalem, historically. He only ever goes to Jerusalem for Passover, and so for the Day of Atonement, these major Jewish holidays, he's going to be there. He'll go then. But all the rest of the year, he doesn't have anything to do in Jerusalem. He spends most of his time in Caesarea, out on the coast of the Mediterranean, where his temple is. But here, he is there just for the holiday. So everything lines up. Pilate, the only man who can execute him, is in town when Jesus has been arrested. And you see kind of how all these things have been, sovereignly lined up so that these events could take place this way. And historically, we know a lot about Pilate, like I said. And history does tell us that what we see about Pilate here fits who he was. He was a politician, right? He was a politician. He was pragmatic. He was self-serving. He could be cruel and harsh, right? But he was expedient. He would compromise. He'd do whatever it took to keep the peace. Which is why we see him, in the end, doing what he does. He doesn't really think Jesus is guilty, but he doesn't want to cause more trouble. What's killing one person if he can keep his job? And that's sort of how he looked at life. Right? And really didn't matter if justice was truly served. Jesus wasn't Roman. He was Jewish. He wasn't a citizen. So if he got killed or not, it didn't really matter to Pilate in the end, as we see. But that's who he was. So we come to Pilate, this politician, and he asks him in verse 2, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Are you the king of the Jews? Now this is a title that Mark is going to use 6 different times now for the rest of the book. This begins the focus here we'll see through the rest of Mark. Is he the king of the Jews? Now many have wondered why Pilate started off asking such a question. Right? Why did he lean into this right away? Well, the reasoning seems to be that the Sanhedrin probably brought all these charges. There's blasphemy. He claims to be a Christ. And he claims to be a king. Pilate doesn't care about the religious charges. Pilate doesn't care about blasphemy. Pilate doesn't believe in the Jewish God, right? None of that matters to him. But what does affect Rome is someone else claiming to be a king. Why? Because if you got this man who's saying he's the king of Judea and Pilate is the governor of Judea, well, only one of the two can be right. And Pilate has an army, Jesus doesn't, right? So if that's what he's going to claim, he wants to really know what's going on, right? If he's going to threaten this territory, that's what Pilate really cares about. So that's the charge that really matters to him and matters to Rome. So he begins by asking this question, are you this? Are you this king? And Jesus answered him, you say so. He does answer Pilate. We've seen up to this point that he doesn't answer really the Sanhedrin except confessing that he's the Messiah. In a minute we'll see he doesn't answer the Sanhedrin again. Why? Well, Isaiah 53, right? He's like a sheep silent before its shears, right? He doesn't speak on purpose. They're going to answer their falsehoods. But he does answer Pilate here. He respects his God-given authority as governor. He's going to give him an answer. But it's an answer that is affirmative, but it's also ambiguous. New Testament scholar R.T. France says that this is a yes, but. The answer is in one way affirmative, but another way it is evasive or reluctant. See, the reasoning behind Jesus' answer here is pretty clear, right? Yes, he is truly this king, but he's not the type of king Pilate thinks he is. Right? He's not the type of king the same way as Jesus tells us in John 18:36 and hit the trial there. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. So yes, he is a king, but not the type of king Pilate thinks he is. His concern is not about the things of this world. But he gives him this answer. And in verse 3, at this point, the chief priests, they jump into the trial itself. Right? So they begin to accuse him of many things. Now, Mark doesn't tell us what the many things are, but Luke does. And so Luke 23, you can go and you can read the accusations they make, and they range from, well, he's telling people not to pay taxes. Well, we know that's not true because he told people explicitly to pay taxes. It was they who were telling people not to pay taxes, right? And all these other things they gave up that were explicitly Jesus had never done. There's no evidence of these things. And so Jesus, we see here, does not answer them. They give up all these fake charges, and Jesus won't acknowledge them. Not at all. He is silent before them, as Isaiah 53 said he would be. So Pilate, seeing that Jesus won't answer, asks him in verse 4, aren't you going to answer? Look at all these things they're accusing you of. And Jesus still did not answer. There's two questions he raised. One, you're going to answer. Two, look at all this stuff. See, Pilate wants and kind of needs Jesus to give an answer because the format of the Roman trials and the Greco-Roman judicial system was pretty straightforward, but there was a proper way they had to do things, right? You'd have the person who was, who they were charging with a crime, right? The charges would be listed, then they would give the accusations, and then the person who was being charged would respond to them, then the judge would get to ask questions, and then he'd make a decision, right? That was the format of the trial. That was what had to happen. You had the accusation, right? You had them arguing for it, but Jesus isn't answering them. So he can't do his part to say, yes, you're guilty or not, because he's got to follow the rules. He's going to try to. And Jesus isn't talking. He's not letting him get what he needs done. So follow-up questions, because he can't engage in what Jesus says. In protocol. But it says here that to his amazement, Jesus still did not answer. He's amazed. And Mark includes the amazement here. It's really important. Because in the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that would have been used in Jesus' day, see, Isaiah 52:15 translates, the nations will be amazed at him. Speaking of Jesus, the suffering servant. And so for Mark to note that Pilate is amazed at Jesus, he's saying, look, Rome is amazed at this man. He's fulfilling the promise of the suffering servant, of the Messiah. And Pilate is amazed. See, for Pilate, here is a man who is obviously not guilty, right? Pilate doesn't believe that Jesus is guilty. And in Pilate's mind, he needs to just defend himself of these obvious bogus charges that Pilate doesn't believe, so that Pilate can move on with his day. Right? There's no need for this sham trial. Pilate understands this. He just needs Jesus to say something so that he can go ahead and get rid of this thing. But Pilate is like the Sanhedrin, in that they're all oblivious to the fact that Jesus has chosen this path for himself. Pilate doesn't understand why Jesus just won't answer so you can get out of this, because he doesn't know that this was his plan. Jesus had chosen this path, that he would be handed over to suffer and die. As he said back in Mark chapter 10, verse 33, when he said, look, we're going to go to Jerusalem. The Son of Man is going to be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And he will rise after 3 days. See, Jesus has said this is what he's going to do, and they don't understand why. But this is what Jesus has decided to do. Why? Because Mark 10:45 tells us the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom. He's come to give his life up. So Jesus is simply doing what he said he would do. He's fulfilling his purpose. He's bringing about salvation for the people. Pilate stares at this, just amazed. See, the Roman world was one who really respected kind of stoic philosophy. Right? One who would stand strong, would not given over to emotion, would deal with the difficulties of the world headlong, just stand up and just take it. Right? They found this purpose. So a little bit of the stoicness we see of Jesus standing here is inspiring to Pilate. It's amazing him that he's just standing here in the face of this. What we have to understand, too, is that though Pilate is amazed by Jesus, amazement does not equal faith. You cannot miss this. To be amazed by Jesus is not the same as faith. To know that Jesus is the King of the Jews, as these people do, does not equal faith. I mean, James reminds us in James 2:19 that the demons know these things, and it doesn't affect anything. It can be quite easy to be amazed by Jesus. When you see what he's done, when we read the miracles, right? When we see the kindness, the love that he shows. We see his boldness. We see his courage, like right here, his willingness to sacrifice. That is amazing, right? We can see that. It can move us. It's why our culture loves things that are based on the Christian story, even though it's not culture generally isn't Christian. That's why like Narnia still sells and all the movies were made, right? And C.S. Lewis was pretty clear, yeah, Aslan's Jesus, right? It's crystal clear, right? And our culture loves this story. They're amazed by what he does, but they're not believers. Same thing with the Lord of the Rings, right? All these things we have in our culture that pulls up these Christian ideals. We can be amazed at the idea of Christ, but we know that amazement does not always equal faith. Why? Why doesn't it? That's what we're going to look at now. Because for the rest of this text, we're presented with different groups of people who were at different times amazed by Jesus, Mark has told us. They all turn away. Let's look at the verses 6 to 15. See, at the festival, Pilate used to release for the people a prisoner whom they requested. There was one named Barabbas who was in prison with rebels who had committed murder during the rebellion. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do for them as was his custom. So Pilate answered, "Do you want me to release the king of the Jews for you?" For he knew it was because of envy that the chief priest had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd so that he would release Barabbas to them instead. See, Pilate asked them again, "Then what do you want me to do with the one you call the king of the Jews?" And they shouted, "Crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Why? What has he done wrong?" They shouted all the more, "Crucify him." And wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. And after having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. See, here the people are, for one last time, pressed with a choice. That is the moment of truth. What will they do with Jesus? See, like I said, Jesus at various times has amazed all of these different groups of people. See, the priests, the leaders, just a few days earlier, Mark tells us that they were, quote, utterly amazed by how he answered and taught in the temple. These were the Pharisees, the Herodians, these were the Sanhedrin. They were utterly amazed at Jesus' teaching just a few days ago. Now they've decided to murder him. What about the crowds? Well, the crowds over and over were amazed at what Jesus had taught, how he taught with authority, how he told people how sins were forgiven, how he caused thousands to be fed with just a few loaves and few fish. People were constantly amazed at Jesus. And even as we saw, Pilate himself was amazed by Jesus. What happens when they are exposed to the truth of Jesus? Let's look. Well, background. Verse 6, we see that at the festival, Pilate used to release for the people a prisoner whom they requested. And there was this guy named Barabbas, I'll talk about him in a second, who was in prison, and committed murder. And they began to ask Jesus to do what was his custom. We find Pilate himself falling into a situation that he must have thought was quite serendipitous. Because here he's got a trial. He's got a man who's clearly innocent. The people accusing him of something he hates. But he won't defend himself. And they've already threatened, if you read John's gospel, that they'll just go to Rome and be happy to let Caesar know there's someone running around claiming to be the king, and that Pilate just did nothing. So they're already blackmailing him. And so he's had this situation dropped into his lap, where members of the community come up to Pilate and request that he grant clemency to a prisoner, because that's what he usually does. At Passover, he grants clemency, he lets someone go, people get happy. He's been in charge at this point for about 5 or 6 years. He's been governor, he's been doing this for a while. This is what the people expect. And really, so Pilate's like, yes, all right. He doesn't have to answer. I've got my loophole. So I'm going to go to the people and ask them if they want me to release for them the king of the Jews. And he phrases it like that on purpose. Why? Because they're Jewish, and this is their king. And while he's not serving, hey, they must have some respect for for their lineage, and Jesus really was the heir of David. He really was. And he said he did this because he knew that the chief priests were envious. They were driven by envy. So he's like, I'll just bypass these guys. I'll go right to the people. They'll release Jesus, and then I'm done. Right? That's his thought. It's a good plan. A very good plan. We'll see it doesn't work, but it is a very good plan. So he asked them, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to release King of the Jews? Because he knew it was because of envy that the chief priests had done this. So let's look at these chief priests and their envy. How did the chief priests respond to Jesus? They respond with envy. You see, they were envious of Jesus' position, of his power, of how the crowd loved him. See, these priests wanted what Jesus had. Envy, we know, is very serious business. Exactly is envy? Well, it's a desire for something that you do not have and the resentment when someone else has it. The chief priests were envious of Jesus' popularity, of his authority, of his abilities. They wanted it for themselves. They very much repeating the sin of Adam in the garden. Right? When they were desirous of what God had, they wanted to be gods themselves, so they did what was forbidden, right? Right? The chief priests wanted what Jesus had. They didn't want to touch taking it. They too do what is forbidden. Their envy drives them to have Jesus killed. Now, that's what the chief priests are guilty of, but is this something we do today? Do we respond to Jesus, or does how we respond to Jesus driven by, say, envy? See, envy we know is a dangerous sin, one that can wreak havoc on a person's faith. Envy can torment our souls. Are we envious towards God? Well, we're envious towards God primarily through our pride. We want the authority, the power that God has. We don't want someone from the outside setting our boundaries. We don't want someone from the outside setting our morals, telling us what is good and evil. We don't want someone judging us. We want to do these things for ourselves. We want to be the masters of our own destiny. Not the master of the universe. That was an awesome cartoon when I was a kid. But we want to be the masters of our own destiny. So what do we do as a society? Well, we reject God. We take that power for ourselves. At least we think that's what we're doing. We think that we can eliminate God and then we can make the rules ourselves. But in reality, we can't take God's authority. Not at all. We can either flourish in it or rebel against it, but in the end, his purposes, his will come to pass. What God has said will come to pass. In many ways, our obsession with self-determination, our rejecting of divine morality, or our own versions of morality do cause us to reject God himself. Our generation is much like the chief priests. Let's look at the crowds. He said, do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? In verse 11, the chief priests stirred up the crowds so that he would release Barabbas to them instead. And Pilate asked them again, then what do you want me to do with the one you call King of the Jews? And they shouted, crucify him. Pilate said to them, why? What has he done wrong? They shouted all the more, crucify him. How do the crowds respond to Jesus? Well, the priests respond by envy. The crowds respond by rejection, by ignoring him. See, what the crowds, the people who just on the Sunday before, this is Friday morning, The Sunday before was Palm Sunday, where the crowds lined the streets as Jesus came in, praising him. He's coming on a donkey. He's the King of the Jews. They were all worked up in a frenzy. But here they allow themselves to get worked up again, obsessed with nationalism, and are easily led astray. See, the Sanhedrin really figured out quickly what Pilate was trying to do. He wasn't as slick as he thought he was. And when they realized that this is what Pilate was doing, they decided to go out to the crowds and convince them, no, we want Barabbas. Now, who was Barabbas? Well, we were introduced to him a bit earlier. And in a nutshell, Barabbas is what we would probably call today a terrorist. Right? He was somebody who was, but to them, he was a freedom fighter. Right? There was a rebellion against Rome, or attempted rebellion against Rome. Many soldiers were killed, the rebellion was put down, and all these people were being executed. Right? In fact, it's believed by scholars that the other two people on either side of Jesus being executed were probably part of that rebellion. That's why Barabbas was in jail too that day, that he was as well going to be executed with the rest of these leaders of this rebellion. Right? But it is Passover. And we have to remember that Passover wasn't simply a religious holiday, it was a national holiday. It was 4th of July. It was when they gained independence from Egypt. They became their own people. It was a day of pride. Barabbas was a freedom fighter. At least that's what the priests were telling them. They need Barabbas. They don't need this miracle-working prophet who tells you to turn the other cheek. He's not going to win us a war. We need Barabbas. And so the crowds start chanting for Barabbas, rejecting Jesus, ignoring who he is, what he has done. So Pilate asked them, well, what do you want me to do with the King of the Jews? Pilate asked that because he's thinking, well, if they still ask to release him, I just will. And I'll say, well, they should have released 2 prisoners. That's where he's going at with this. Well, what do you mean to do with this guy? You want me to let him go too? Instead of the crowd saying, yeah, we'll take him too, they respond with crucify him. And Pilate is shocked. The statement, why, what has he done wrong, is an exclamation that Pilate cannot believe that's the answer he got. He was not expecting that. He's like, why? What has he done that I should execute him? But instead of giving him an answer, they shouted all the more, crucify him. Instead of answering Pilate, they just screamed for him to be crucified. See, the crowds allowed themselves to get all worked up, distracted by the events, thinking they're freeing this revolutionary freedom fighter who's on their side. This person will help them. They have no real roots in their excitement for Jesus that was seen just a few days earlier. They demand this man who has done nothing wrong to be crucified. Why? Because he can't defeat Rome, but Barabbas can. I mean, he's already captured, so no, he clearly can't, but logic goes out the window, right? They want Barabbas. Jesus can't give them what they think they need. Ignore him. Then they come to Pilate. What does Pilate do? Verse 15. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. After having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. Pilate too will reject Jesus, though he was amazed at him. Why? Because of the fear of man. Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowds. Pilate cared more about what the crowds thought of him than he did about doing what was right, what was just. As the judge of the area, it was his job to make sure that the law was followed faithfully. But when push came to shove, he cared more about satisfying the people than he does in upholding justice. He cares more about keeping his job than he cares about believing in Jesus. Too much he cared about his position, his wealth, his power. And it chokes out whatever amazement he might have had and keeps that from turning into faith. And in these 3 groups of people, I got a connection I want you to catch here. You can write it in your bulletin if you want. But these groups of people match perfectly with what Jesus told us the responses to him would be like in the parable of the sower in Matthew 13. See, Jesus gives us this parable of the sower over in Matthew's gospel, and it's so good what he tells us. This is what he says. Consider the sower who went out to sow. As he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and birds came and devoured them. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil. It grew up quickly since the soil wasn't deep. When the sun came, it was scorched. Since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns came up and choked it. Still other seed fell on good ground. Some produced fruit, some 100, some 60, some 30 times it was sown. Let him who have ears to hear, let him hear. And then he explains what this means in a second. He goes, this is the kingdom, right? Because some of it's snatched away before it can be sown in their heart. And there's some on the rocky ground where they receive the word, but there's no roots and it goes away. And there's some who it's sown among the thorns, right? And this is the worries of the world choke it out before it can grow. This is what we have. The Pharisees are the ones who are sown out on the road, right? They're sown out on the path. The amazement of who Jesus is never takes root in their heart. Why? Because they're distracted. They don't care. They're motivated by themselves. They might be amazed by Jesus. Yeah, sure, but they still want to kill him. The crowds are like these who are sown on the rocky ground, right? These crowds had some fury, they had some fervor, they had some excitement, but it just withered away just simply by a few troublemakers in the crowd telling you to crucify him. Well, okay, that sounds good. Wait, weren't you just like praising him 5 days ago? Oh yeah, now we're going to crucify him. No root. And Pilate is this perfect example of the seed that is sown, the word that is sown among the thorns. He's amazed by Jesus. He believes that he is innocent. His wife has told him, have nothing to do with this. He wants to wash his hands of this whole thing. In fact, we see from the gospel, he tries to give away to Herod to do something with. He doesn't want to do this. He's amazed at who Jesus is. He kind of believes him in a way. But the minute his power, his wealth, his status is threatened, whatever love he might have had for Jesus, it disappears. All three groups reject Jesus. All of them do. Now, how do we make sure we're not one of those groups of people? Right? How are we the good soil? How do we not respond in this way? How do we cultivate faith? Well, it's to take what they did and use it in our own lives. Right? To see how we're living. Make sure we're not driven by envy or pride like the priests. Make sure we're not easily distracted by the cares of this world like the crowds. Make sure we don't have this fear of man and love of wealth and power like Pilate. How do we do that? Well, Jesus talks about it all over the place. All over the place he tells us ways we can cultivate our faith in this world. Just from the Sermon on the Mount, we see things like, consider the lilies of the field. He tells that story. What's he telling us? You don't have to be anxious about anything. It says, if God will clothe them in such wonder, will he not take care of you? It's about trusting in God, day by day, to care for you. Not to be anxious. Cultivate our faith by trusting in God. Second, by seeking first the kingdom of heaven, not seeking to build our own mini kingdoms here. Every kingdom of this earth will rise and fall. The Roman Empire fell. So did the empire after that. And after that. There's only one eternal empire. Kingdom. Empire's too like Star Wars. Kingdom. And it's God's. That's where we are to build our kingdom. That's the kingdom we are to seek. And in doing so, we should be careful what we cherish. And ultimately, we simply need to follow Jesus' example. Throughout his life, he shows us how to live. Right? Constantly praying, learning and teaching the word, gathering in worship, doing the things that are simple. They're key to growing our faith. That's how we avoid being one of the crowds. I want to end with a quote that I thought was really helpful from Sinclair Ferguson. This is what he says. Without knowing it, the religious leaders and Pilate crowd are all part of this tapestry of grace which God is weaving for sinners. Their actions speak louder than their words. Jesus was not dying for his own crimes. He was dying for the crimes of others. Not for his own sins, but for the sins of others. He did not die for himself. He dies for us. So what we have to ask ourselves in response to these groups of people is, are we seeing what they were too blind to see? Do we see Jesus as he is, our Savior, or are we blinded? Pride or envy or cares of this world to notice Jesus. What will you do with the King of the Jews? Let's pray. Father, we are grateful for your grace and your mercy. As we reflect on your word, Lord, let us not be too quick to think that we are guiltless. Let's not be too quick to we not reflect upon our own lives and hearts as we see the responses of others to you. Father, I pray that we would be quick and ready to repent. Whether we are struggling with pride or obsessed with the cares of this world or afraid of what others might think of us if we believe. Father, let us instead see you for who you are. Let us respond to you as you have called us to. Far too often it's easy to get swept away and to cast you to the side. Father, I pray that would not be the case with us. That we would seek to have a faith that is sure and true. That we would respond to you and your word. You've called us to, for you have given us hope and life. And Father, I pray that we will respond to your truth as you have called us to by faith. That in that we might have eternal life. God, we pray these things in your holy name.